Welcome back to StillPoint Logic. This is our time to slow down, reflect, and try to meet ourselves with some honesty. Today is episode 7, and it's, not gonna lie, one of my favorites. It's about the inner critique versus yourself, which is something that's very close to home. So the conversation is about the voice inside you that judges, pressures, and sometimes sounds so familiar you mistake it for truth. There's a moment, usually private, when you hear a voice that feels like it came from inside you, but isn't really for you. It comments on what you said, what you did, and what you didn't do, and it never seems satisfied. This is the inner critique, and today we're going to learn how to step out of its shadow. And before we begin, a brief link back to episode 4, the one about overthinking. If you remember, overthinking was presented as a protective mechanism, a way your mind tries to create safety by predicting every possible outcome. But the inner critique is different. Where overthinking tries to prepare you, the inner critique tries to control you. Both voices create a mental looping tension, but their emotional signature is different, and today we're going to explore the difference. So let's begin. You have goals. You have wants. You have days where you want to do things differently, and then there's the voice. You should have done more. Why can't you get this right? Other people aren't struggling with this. You're falling behind. You're not enough. Most people don't think of this as a voice. They think of it as themselves. This is the tricky thing about the inner critique. It doesn't sound like it's an intruder. It sounds like your own thoughts wearing an authoritative tone. Let me tell you about Mara. Mara is 34 years old. She's smart, competent, thoughtful, the kind of person people trust with things that matter. But inside, she carries a relentless narrator. Last week, Mara missed something small, a routine she'd promised herself she'd keep. It was nothing dramatic, no one got hurt. She just didn't do it. So at first, it barely registered, but later, that inner voice arrived. Of course you didn't follow through. You never do. You always start things and let them slide. This is why nothing changes. Her body responded before her mind did. So she felt bad. Her chest tightened and she had an energy drop. And she didn't question the voice because it sounded very familiar. It sounded responsible and accurate. And I think that if you'd ask Mara about it, she wouldn't say, oh, I felt like I was criticizing myself. I think she would say she was just being honest about what was happening. And that's the thing about the inner critique. It doesn't show up waving a red flag saying, I am here to ruin your day. It shows up sounding very reasonable, like it's stating facts, and it convinces you that disappointment is your reality. So instead of, I wish I had handled that better, it becomes, I'm terrible at this. I always mess things up. This is just who I am. So the critique takes a moment and turns it into your identity. It turns your efforts into failure. It turns your frustration into an actual personality flaw. And going back to the connection with episode 4, these are the two narrators that we have. So if you've listened to episode 4 on overthinking, you might recognize the pattern here. Overthinking is the looping. The inner critique is the voice inside the loop. In episode 4, we talked about how overthinking is often an attempt to control uncertainty. Like you run scenarios, you fill in gaps, you try to predict outcomes. But in this episode, we meet the narrator behind that behavior, the voice that says, you should have known better. You didn't do enough. Try again, fix more, perfect more. Overthinking is the engine, self-criticism is the fuel, and the inner critique sits in the driver's seat. Now let's speak about it differently, not as the observer of the inner critique, but from the perspective of someone who's trying to understand its architecture from the inside. Because the inner critique is not born out of malice. It is built out of old rules, ways we were praised, experiences that were complicated for us, moments that we didn't do great from our perception, ways we were corrected, ways you learned to earn love, or ways you tried to avoid shame. It is a narrator who believes it is keeping you safe, but its methods are outdated and they are very unkind. This narrator magnifies flaws. It minimizes your strengths. It filters every memory through judgment. It speaks in absolutes and impossibilities, and it pretends to be objective, but it is deeply, deeply biased. And here's the key. The inner critique is not your actual voice. It is a voice. It's one narrator among many. You can question it, you can disagree with it, you can replace it with a wiser narrator when you choose. So now let's go deeper. There's an old teaching story about a merchant who used the scale to weigh goods in his market. On one day, a traveler pointed out that the scale was tilted very slightly, almost invisibly, but it was tilted to one side. Everything the merchant measured looked heavier than it truly was. But because he had used the scale for years and years and years, the number felt familiar, so he took them as if they were accurate. They just felt right. And even when customers said this seems too heavy, he didn't argue with them, but it wasn't to deceive them. It was because he trusted the scale more than he trusted his own eyes. That is self-criticism. A scale you've used so long, you call the distortion truth. And the inner critique doesn't just judge you, it mismeasures you. It takes your mistakes and weighs them too heavily, and it takes your worth as if it's not worth anything at all. And once you understand the scale is broken, you stop accepting every number that it gives you. And I want to make this point even stronger. We have to understand that self-criticism is not simply negative self-talk. It has structure. It has a belief system, and it feels like it has a moral tone. But we need to look at self-criticism as a kind of internal philosophy built on faulty premises. It follows a logic, but the logic is flawed. Most inner critiques follow one of these core beliefs. If I'm hard on myself, I won't fail. This is actually fear disguised as discipline. Number 2, if I criticize myself first, no one else can hurt me. This is actually protection disguised as preemptive attack. Number 3, if I don't meet the highest standard, I'm not worthwhile. This is self-worth being mistaken for performance. And number 4, if I stop pushing, everything will collapse. This is anxiety pretending to be structure. Self-criticism is a persuasive tool because it masquerades as responsibility. But responsibility doesn't shame. Responsibility guides. And here is where episode 4 meets us again. Overthinking and self-criticism are close cousins. Overthinking says, let me analyze everything so nothing surprises me. The inner critique says, if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. Both create mental tension, both give the illusion of control, but only the inner critique attacks your sense of self. The key difference is overthinking worries about outcomes, self-criticism worries about you. And it worries in a way that diminishes rather than strengthens. Now, stepping out of our usual flow, I want to share some of my thoughts and beliefs about words, sharing events, and how this doesn't usually work in our benefit. And again, this is not about forcing positive self-talk or repeating mantras. It's just about being more careful with the language we use about ourselves at all times. And why words matter. The language we choose influences how we feel, not just in the moment, but also over time. Sharp words, self-criticism, or exaggerated negative descriptions, they create pointy emotions, and these poke at our well-being. Even the stories we tell ourselves repeatedly can keep us stuck in low energy instead of helping us move forward. There's more to it than just feeling bad. Our brains start to believe the words we say. When we speak harshly to ourselves, about ourselves, like, I'm not enough, I always mess things up, we actually plant a seed in our mind, and over time, our feelings begin to align with those statements, shaping how we see ourselves, how we act, and even how we experience the world. What I'm trying to say is that the story that we tell ourselves can at some point manifest into our reality. It's not magic. It's simply the natural outcome of thoughts influencing actions. And what's sometimes overlooked is that we don't need to replace these words with overly positive ones for change to happen. Using more natural language, or sometimes choosing not to label ourselves at all, already reduces the harm. So describing what happened without exaggeration gives the nervous system room to settle. The same is true for words of compassion. Speaking gently to yourself, acknowledging your efforts, or framing challenges with curiosity, it plants a different seed, one that can grow into something more compassionate, give you more resilience and self-respect. Words are not just reflections of thoughts. They are tools for shaping your inner world. As a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein observed, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. He argued that the structure and scope of our language shape what we can think, understand, and perceive. In his later work, he expanded this idea, showing that the meaning of words comes from how we use them in everyday life. In other words, the language you choose actively shapes your experience of reality. So ask yourself, if words are seeds, which ones will you plant today? Which inner narrative will you nurture? The critical, shrinking voice, or one that allows things to be as they are? And now it's tempting to keep talking about what went wrong, a bad experience, a mistake, a negative feeling, thinking you're venting or getting support. But I strongly believe that repeating the story might throw you back into the situation that made you feel bad instead of helping you move on. Your feeling may rise again, and if you were starting to feel a bit better, that might take you a step back. And I do see some risks in sharing too much. Talking to people might feel helpful, but it can also bring confusion. Other people may give advice without knowing the whole picture. Based on their answers, you might start questioning choices that can't be undone, and your feelings will spiral even further, and it will fuel your inner critique instead of easing it. You have to remember, when you share your struggles, people often want to share theirs too. If you're already feeling low, more negative stories aren't going to lift you up. What you need in those moments are natural or positive conversations, something that allows your mind to think clearly, to reassess and reframe the situation. That's why I think that sometimes staying quiet helps. Sometimes the best way forward isn't talking at all. It's reflecting. And I don't mean suppressing, and I don't mean running away, just giving yourself space to process things. Using logic-based reflection techniques, you can question your assumptions. You can look for your hidden virtues and find a different perspective. And with practice, you might discover that a little quiet reflection is exactly what you need instead of repeating the same story again and again. When you go quiet and you reflect, sometimes things look clearer and you feel that you're more in control. That's when your inner critique loses some of its power on you. Now let's quickly go through the logic exercises that we usually do. The first step is just naming the inner critique. Externalize the voice. We need to give it a name. Say, this is a thought I am hearing, not a truth I am living. Now we need to ask the question of proportion. Does the intensity of my self-judgment match the actual facts? Because most inner critique reactions are tends to a two-level event. We have to be very critical about this. That's where we have to slow down and try to see what's really happening. The next step is we need to try and replace the negative thought with a little bit of curiosity. So instead of saying to yourself, why did I mess this up? We can try and look at it from a different point of view. And I know it's very hard, but in time you do get used to it. So instead of saying messing up, you can ask, what can I learn from this moment? And you have to honor your effort. You have to be rational about what you do, and you have to have compassion. Because if you're trying to be a perfectionist, perfectionism ignores effort. And here is a rational moral perspective. Premise 1. Human worth is not dependent on flawless performance. Premise 2. Imperfection is a universal condition, not a personal failing. Therefore, the conclusion, I can be imperfect and still be good, capable, and fully worthy. And this perspective isn't soft, it's realistic. It acknowledges that self-criticism doesn't strengthen people, it shrinks them. Feeling good doesn't come from self-criticism. It comes from being aware, from reflecting, and avoiding unnecessary negative labels. And here we are at the end of episode 7. I want to thank you for spending this time with yourself and with me. And I know this episode might be a little heavier than others, but it's really important. You have to remember the inner critique pretends to protect you. But protection built on fear is not protection at all. Today you ask yourself, whose voice are you listening to? The harsh narrator or the wiser one? The one that remembers you are human, capable, constantly learning, and worthy. And when you can tell the difference between the two, something shifts. You will reclaim yourself. In our next episode, we'll continue exploring how your internal philosophies shape your emotional life and how you can shift them with reason, awareness, and compassion. But until then, tell yourself the good story. I want to thank you for listening. The reflections in this podcast are inspired by logic-based therapy, a philosophical counseling model developed by Dr. Elliot D. Cohen. I'm a certified logic-based therapy consultant, and what I share here is my own perspective on its principles. This podcast is meant for reflection and learning and isn't a substitute for professional mental health. Take care, and I'll see you next time. at your still point.